Taoiseach, yesterday we raised with the Taoiseach the issue of the very large pensions being paid out to former bankers that brought the state to the brink of ruin. The Taoiseach was running for cover and hid behind the Constitution and property rights and the advice of the Attorney General that, of course, he won't publish on that issue. I want to raise a related issue with you, Taoiseach. We know that 6 top executives in the former Anglo Irish Bank are earning in excess of €500,000. Of course, this makes an absolute mockery of the so-called cap for bankers. Of course, this is a bank that was bailed out by Fianna Fáil, is presided over by a former Fine Gael leader, and yet thumbs its nose at the Irish people, and all the while the Labour Party sing dumb.
Sorry, would you please allow the deputy? Sorry, would you?
As the budget grows,
would you please allow the deputy without interruption? Thank you. As
the budget draws closer, and many people, including students, it has to be said, are raging that the very ones who brought the state to its knees continue to enjoy exorbitant pay and pensions. Now, I understand from a response to a parliamentary question that Minister for Finance Michael Noonan actually asked Alan Dukes in April last to reduce the pay of these bankers, and Mr. Dukes told him to get lost.
Thank you.
So, do you think it's acceptable, Taoiseach, that a former Fine Gael leader, who, by the way, and it's Alan Dukes, continues himself to claim a large ministerial pension, who presides over this bankrupt, toxic bank, and yet tells the government to get lost?
Taoiseach.
I do not think it is acceptable that former executives of Anglo Irish Bank, as it is in this case, or former executives of any of the other banks that had to be bailed out with Irish taxpayers' money, should be on pensions of over €500,000 a year. Neither do I think that it is acceptable that executives of the current IBRC should be on salaries of that scale. And neither does the Taoiseach think that it is acceptable, and neither does the Minister for Finance. And that is why the Minister for Finance told the IBRC in April that those salaries should be reduced. And that is why the Minister for Finance has undertaken a full review of those salaries that are being paid. And of course you know that because he wrote to the finance spokespersons of each of the political parties in this House in the summertime, informing you that that review was underway. He has in recent weeks secured the assistance of financial advisors from Mercer's to work through the various options as to how this will be dealt with. So I want to make it very clear, because this is something that is not acceptable to the government. It is not acceptable to the people of this country who have had to suffer the consequences of what these banks did and the way in which they were managed and the way in which they were run. And it is not acceptable that former executives of these banks are on these kind of pensions, and it is not acceptable that current executives of the IBRC in particular are on these levels of salaries. It is something that is being reviewed and looked at by the Minister for Finance, and it is something that is very much in hand by the government.
Thank you. Deputy McDonald, thank you.
Taoiseach, it is equally not acceptable that the government continues to take a hands-off approach in all of these matters. You see, you're very quick to move in and make the cuts where you see you have what you would possibly consider a soft target. But I can't help but be struck by the fact that you step very gently around these senior banking executives. It's not acceptable either that a former minister and former Fine Gael leader who is involved with this bank tells the Minister for Finance to get lost, because that's what happened when that conversation took place in April. They're not going to come at salary cuts voluntarily. So Tánaiste, the hands-off approach, the gently approach that you reserve for the high flyers within banking simply is not going to work. It's not acceptable either that a former leader of your own party, and now allegedly a public watchdog in AIB, I refer to Dick Spring.
Sorry, would you mind putting a supplementary? Thank you.
I referred to Dick Spring, was in place when all of these gold-plated pension arrangements were put in place.
Deputy, would you please adhere to the chair? You're over time. Would you please put your...
So, you say that all of this is unacceptable and abhorrent to you. Well, let's take you on your word. You see, a review and kicking the can down the road is not going to cut it. What are you going to do now? What are you going to do in advance of December's budget to put these matters to right and to stop the practice where these executives are on salaries of over €500,000? That needs to stop.
Deputy, I won't ask you.
They deserve at least that.